The Grand Hotel Kempinski in Geneva radiated an aura of polished power, its lakeside facade reflecting the placid waters and the distant snow-dusted Alps. Inside, the air itself seemed different, filtered, perfumed with expensive cologne, and the subtle scent of old money mingling with new ambition. It was the opening reception of the annual International Investment Summit, a convergence point for global capital, political influence, and the carefully cultivated egos that accompanied them. Waiters glided silently with trays of champagne and intricate canapes, their movements choreographed to avoid disturbing the low, urgent murmur of multi-billion-dollar conversations. Jean-Pierre Dubois, CEO of GlobalCorp Minerals, surveyed the scene from a slightly elevated alcove, a position he instinctively sought. He radiated satisfaction, the deep intrinsic certainty of a man who believed he occupied the apex of the food chain. His suit, a dark Brioni masterpiece, probably cost more than the annual income of most citizens in the countries his company operated in. His silver hair was perfect, his handshake firm, his smile deployed strategically. Beside him, his aide Antoine shifted nervously, clutching a portfolio thick with prospectuses and briefing notes. Antoine existed in Dubois' orbit, reflecting his boss's brilliance while absorbing his casual cruelties. "Observe, Antoine," Dubois said, his voice a low purr of contentment meant to convey effortless superiority. The dance of influence. Prime ministers bowing slightly to banking consortium heads, hedge fund managers whispering sweet nothings into the ears of energy ministers, and all of them, he made a subtle gesture encompassing the room. Understand, whether they admit it or not, that true progress, true wealth extraction, requires facilitators, visionaries, men like me. He took a delicate sip of champagne. GlobalCorp isn't just a mining company. We are enablers of national potential. Remember that phrase. Yes, Monsieur Dubois. Your keynote yesterday was extremely well received, Antoine offered, eager to please. The Nigerian delegation was particularly interested in the proposed Cobalt initiative. Dubois waved a dismissive hand, the large signet ring on his finger catching the light. Nigeria is mature, stable, bureaucratic. The real opportunities, the transformative ones, lie where structure is fluid, where decisiveness, he smirked, can be incentivized. Burkina Faso, for instance. Untapped lithium, manganese, gold. A treasure chest waiting for the right key. And currently, he lowered his voice conspiratorially, blessed with a leadership situation that suggests flexibility. He meant the recent coup that had brought a young military captain to power. Such transitions, in Dubois' experience, often created openings for savvy operators willing to provide stability and investment when formal diplomatic channels were cautious. It was then that the tenor of the room subtly shifted. A collective glance, a momentary pause in conversations, rippled outwards from the main entrance. Through the sea of dark suits and designer dresses moved a small, distinct group. At its center walked Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the interim president of Burkina Faso. He was younger than almost everyone else, holding significant power in the room, perhaps mid-30s. What truly set him apart, however, wasn't his age, but his attire. He wore simple, clean, but undeniably military fatigues. The functional camouflage pattern, a stark, almost defiant contrast to the luxurious surroundings. A plain red beret sat squarely on his head. His expression was serious, devoid of performative geniality. He scanned the room not with the eagerness of a supplicant, but with the quiet intensity of an observer assessing a complex field. Lieutenant Diallo, his aide, matched his professional austerity. Dubois watched their entrance, his eyes narrowing. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. He deliberately raised his voice, ensuring nearby clusters of delegates could easily overhear. "Ah, Antoine, look. It appears someone mistook the summit for a recruitment drive. Or perhaps," he paused for effect, eliciting a few uncomfortable chuckles from those closest. "Captain Camouflage believes this pattern helps him blend in with the floral arrangements?" Antoine winced, flushing deeply. He darted a nervous glance towards Traoré's group, then back at his boss. "Monsieur, please." Dubois ignored him, relishing the attention. "Honestly, the lack of basic savoir-faire is staggering. How do you expect to negotiate multi-million-dollar investment deals? To reassure international partners of stability and competence when you arrive dressed as if you've just crawled out of a foxhole? Presentation matters. It shows you understand the rules of the game. It shows you belong." This, this is just embarrassing. An insult, frankly, to the gravity of this gathering. He took another sip of champagne, his eyes glittering with malicious amusement. Perhaps GlobalCorp could offer him a line of credit for a decent suit? Captain Traoré, who had paused to greet an African Union representative, must have heard. For a fleeting moment, his steady movement through the room ceased. His head turned slightly, his gaze sweeping coolly across the space, passing over Dubois and his small audience without any discernible flicker of emotion. No anger, no indignation, not even acknowledgement. It was the look one might give a mildly distracting insect, before refocusing on the task at hand. He then resumed his path, engaging in quiet conversation with his aide, leaving Dubois feeling oddly insignificant, despite having landed what he thought was a clever blow. The lack of reaction, the calm indifference, pricked at Dubois' ego far more than any angry retort could have. He huffed, turned his back pointedly, and steered Antoine towards a prominent European banker, dismissing the man in fatigues as a negligible novelty. The next afternoon, Captain Traoré addressed the summit. The main auditorium was filled, the delegates drawn by a mixture of curiosity and morbid expectation. Would the young soldier rant, plead, offer unbelievable concessions? Traoré walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and waited for silence. He carried no sheaf of papers, relying instead on sparse notes. His delivery was calm, measured, lacking the theatrical flourishes favored by many speakers. But his words carried an undeniable weight. He spoke not of tax incentives or deregulation, the usual lures for foreign capital. Instead, he spoke of Burkina Faso's history, its dignity, its struggle for true independence, not just political, but economic. We stand before you today not as beggars, he stated, his voice resonating clearly in the large hall, but as representatives of a sovereign people, custodians of a rich land. For too long, the wealth extracted from our soil has flowed outwards, enriching foreign shareholders, while our communities contend with environmental degradation and unfulfilled promises. He looked directly at the sections where representatives of major extractive industries were seated. We seek genuine partners, not patrons. We welcome investment that aligns with our national development strategy, investment that empowers our citizens through fair employment, skills transfer, and infrastructure development, investment that respects our environment and contributes equitably to our national treasury. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The model of resource exploitation where host nations receive mere crumbs from the table of their own wealth is over. Mutual respect is the foundation of any viable partnership. And respect, his gaze briefly seemed to find Dubois in the audience, though it was impossible to be sure, is demonstrated through actions, transparency, and fairness, not measured by the tailoring of one's clothes or the glibness of one's speech. He concluded by outlining principles for future resource contracts: enhanced transparency, mandatory local content requirements, stricter environmental safeguards, and mechanisms for community benefit sharing. Burkina Faso is open for business, he finished, but it is business on our terms, terms that prioritize the long-term well-being of the Burkinabe people. The response was muted but palpable, a nervous shifting in seats among some mining executives, intrigued murmurs from representatives of nations facing similar challenges. Dubois, however, leaned over to Antoine, whispering with theatrical exasperation, pure fantasy, noble perhaps in a tragically naive way. He'll learn. Reality has a harsh way of correcting such idealism. Let's discuss the logistics for the new drills at the Koro site. He dismissed Traoré's speech as posturing, a temporary inconvenience born of revolutionary fervor that would soon yield to economic pragmatism, or, if necessary, the strategic application of GlobalCorp's considerable influence. Back in Paris, weeks later, Dubois' confidence began to erode, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. The initial phase involved expanding GlobalCorp's massive Koro mine complex in Burkina Faso, permits that were once rubber-stamped after a facilitation payment, handled discreetly by Grégoire Dubois, Jean-Pierre's well-connected cousin and GlobalCorp's longtime man in Ouagadougou, were suddenly stalled, Grégoire reported back, his voice tight with unaccustomed anxiety. Jean-Pierre, it's different now, Grégoire admitted over a secure line. The old channels are closed. Ministry officials cite new directives from the presidency. They insist on following every regulation to the letter. They are asking for historical environmental impact data well, data that might be difficult to compile accurately. Dubois scoffed. Difficult or inconvenient? Gregoire, you've handled tin pot dictators and revolutionary councils before. Find the right person. Everyone has a weakness, a desire. Up the consultancy fee. Remind them who provides thousands of jobs. I've tried, Jean-Pierre. Gregoire sounded genuinely worried. The usual incentives are being refused. Politely but firmly. There's a new mood here. Audits are being mentioned. People are afraid to step out of line. They talk about patriotism. He said the last word as if it were an alien concept. Dubois slammed his fist on the antique partner's desk that dominated his office. Patriotism? Funded by what? Idealism doesn't pay the bills. This is Traoré's doing. That insolent soldier thinks he can play hardball with GlobalCorp? He's forgotten who holds the real power. The situation deteriorated further. It wasn't just about new permits. A formal letter arrived from the Burkina Faso Ministry of Mines. It didn't just request documents. It announced a comprehensive independent audit of GlobalCorp's entire operational history in the country, spanning 15 years. The letter cited vague but ominous clauses in the original agreement regarding national interest review and compliance verification. Clauses Dubois had always considered legal boilerplate, easily bypassed. An audit? Of 15 years? Dubois bellowed, pacing his office overlooking the Place Vendôme. This is harassment, a shakedown. Antoine, get me the Minister of Mines on the phone, now. Antoine, looking paler than usual, hesitated. Monsieur, I've tried. All calls are being routed through the minister's official secretariat. They request formal written communication outlining the purpose of the call. Written communication? Dubois stared incredulously. I don't write requests. I give instructions. Since when do I need an appointment? The audit began with unsettling efficiency. Teams of Burkina Faso auditors, accompanied by independent international environmental consultants hired by the government, descended on the Koro Mine and GlobalCorp's Ouagadougou offices. They were polite, professional, but unyielding. They demanded access to core sample analyses, wastewater discharge logs, payroll records, tax filings, community development fund accounts, digging into areas where corners had historically been cut, where figures had been massaged, where inconvenient truths had been buried under layers of complicity facilitated by Gregoire's network. Whispers turned into articles in specialized mining industry publications, then spilled into the mainstream financial press. Anonymous government sources leaked preliminary findings, significant discrepancies between declared mineral yields and estimated geological potential, evidence suggesting years of underreporting income for tax purposes, alarming data showing heavy metal contamination in water sources downstream from tailings ponds, consistent with long-standing, previously ignored complaints from local villagers. Testimonies emerged from former employees about safety violations allegedly covered up by local management. GlobalCorp's stock, a blue-chip stalwart, began a worrying slide. Dubois launched a furious counteroffensive. High-powered lobbyists were dispatched to Brussels and Washington. Op-eds decrying the politicization of contracts and the unstable investment climate appeared in major newspapers, ghost-written by GlobalCorp's expensive PR firm. Legal teams drafted intimidating letters threatening international arbitration. Dubois personally called influential contacts in finance and government, demanding they apply pressure on Traoré's regime. But the pressure points seemed less sensitive than before. Western governments, wary of being seen to prop up potentially exploitative corporate practices, and perhaps cautiously respecting the assertive new stance from Ouagadougou, offered lukewarm diplomatic statements about hoping for a mutually agreeable resolution. Other African nations watched with keen interest, some quietly applauding Burkina Faso's move. The narrative was shifting. GlobalCorp, used to playing the victim of unreasonable governments, was increasingly being cast as a potentially unscrupulous actor facing long overdue accountability. The audit continued relentlessly. Inside GlobalCorp, panic began to set in. Board members, initially supportive of Dubois' aggressive stance, started asking difficult questions during increasingly tense video calls. Shareholder groups expressed alarm. Analysts downgraded the stock, citing the mounting uncertainty and potential for massive financial liabilities, back taxes, fines, environmental remediation costs that could run into hundreds of millions. Dubois felt the walls closing in. His carefully constructed world, built on the assumption of perpetual leverage, was proving unexpectedly fragile. He couldn't bribe his way out. He couldn't intimidate his way out. He couldn't charm his way out. He found himself fixated, almost obsessively, on the image of Captain Traoré in his simple fatigues at the Geneva summit, the quiet gaze, the calm indifference. Had he fundamentally misread the man? Misread the entire situation? Was this meticulous dismantling a direct consequence of that moment of public mockery? Or was it something bigger, a historical tide turning against the way GlobalCorp, and he himself, had always done business? The final blow came swiftly and decisively. In a packed press conference in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's Minister of Mines stepped before the cameras. With Captain Traoré standing silently beside him, looking as resolute as he had in Geneva, the minister delivered the verdict. The preliminary audit, he announced, had uncovered grave and systemic violations of the National Mining Code, environmental laws, and the contractual obligations GlobalCorp had signed. Effective immediately, GlobalCorp's license to operate the Koro mine and all related concessions was suspended pending a full criminal investigation and potential permanent revocation. Evidence of significant tax evasion, environmental damage, and disregard for worker safety would be pursued through both national and potentially international legal channels. Furthermore, the minister declared that this was a precedent. All existing foreign resource contracts would be subject to similar rigorous review based on the newly enforced principles of sovereignty, transparency, and mutual benefit. The news hit the global markets like a shockwave. GlobalCorp's stock plummeted over 60% within hours, erasing billions in value. Trading had to be halted. Credit rating agencies issued immediate downgrades. The company faced insolvency. An emergency board meeting was convened, not in the opulent Paris headquarters, but via a frantic encrypted video conference. The anger and fear were palpable. Jean-Pierre Dubois, impeccably dressed even in crisis, tried to rally them, speaking of fighting back, of arbitration, of powerful allies. But his words rang hollow. The accusations were too specific, the evidence trail apparently too strong, the political will in Burkina Faso too firm. The board, facing lawsuits from enraged shareholders and the complete collapse of the company's reputation, saw only one way to attempt damage control. Jean-Pierre, the lead independent director said, his voice strained but final, for the good of the company, what remains of it, we need your immediate resignation. Dubois stared at the screen, speechless for perhaps the first time in his adult life. The arrogance finally shattered, replaced by numb disbelief. The man who mocked a leader's simple fatigues as a sign of weakness had been undone by the quiet resolve that uniform represented. His empire, built on leveraging perceived weakness and circumventing inconvenient rules, had dissolved under the steady application of those very rules, wielded by a government he had fatally underestimated. Stripped of his power, his reputation in tatters, facing years of legal battles and public disgrace, Jean-Pierre Dubois became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and exclusive clubs. He had learned, far too late, that true power isn't always showcased in expensive suits or wielded through backroom deals. Sometimes it resides in the quiet dignity of a people reclaiming their sovereignty, represented by a leader whose simple attire spoke volumes more about substance than any tailored facade ever could. Captain Traoré, meanwhile, continued his work in Ouagadougou, focused on navigating the immense challenges facing Burkina Faso, the Geneva incident likely a footnote in his mind, even as its consequences reshaped the landscape of resource extraction, far beyond his nation's borders. The world, stunned, had been served a potent reminder. Never judge the strength of the current by the quietness of its surface.